Hello everyone and welcome to TBR's webinar, Public Cloud Market, How Leading Vendors Are Addressing Evolving Customer Demand, Insights from TBR's Public Cloud Benchmark. I'm Justin Surgeon and I'm hosting today's session. TBR's 4Q14 Public Cloud Benchmark highlights trends that drove 2014 revenue, as well as evolving trends that will drive future success across SaaS, PaaS, IaaS markets. Amazon Web Services, Google, Microsoft, and Salesforce will lead the market, but Workday and ServiceNow, IBM, and SAP are catching up quickly. During the webinar, we will discuss portfolio evolution necessary to address industry-specific and enterprise needs, the developer landscape, and the importance of ecosystems and highlights from vendors' ecosystems. Before we begin the presentation, there are a few housekeeping items I'd like to cover. First, we'll be recording today's session and posting it on our YouTube site, TBRI channel. We encourage you to visit our channel to watch this presentation or any of the others we've posted. Second, we'd like to hear your thoughts and opinions on the material we're presenting. Please send any questions you have to the Q&A function. We will address them at the end of the presentation. Third, we'll send out the slides to everyone registered for today's presentation within 24 hours of the conclusion of the webinar. You can also find the slides, as well as our thought leadership pieces and other webinars on SlideShare at slideshare.net/TBR_market_insight. Now let me introduce the analyst presenting today. Principal Analyst Allan Krans leads TBR's coverage of the technologies and business models at play across the cloud computing landscape. Allan is the content editor of TBR's Public Cloud Benchmark. Jillian Mirandi is a senior analyst at TBR's cloud practice, responsible for analyzing key vendors in the market. Jillian is lead author on several TBR syndicated reports and benchmarks, including the Public Cloud Report. Kelsey Mason, an analyst in TBR's cloud practice, is responsible for coverage of software and cloud vendors, including Microsoft, SAP, Salesforce, Workday, and Verizon. And with that, let me hand this over to the analyst.
Great, thanks Justin, and thanks everybody for joining today. Before we get into today's specific content, I want to just take a step back and kind of tell you a little bit about why we think public cloud is actually becoming an increasingly important part of enterprise cloud adoption going forward. What we're seeing is this shift from a focus around companies that were very specific in terms of the solutions that were being delivered, targeted a very low barriers to entry type business model where customers were able to sign up very quickly, deploy target services, and be able to get the benefits of IT around very focused areas in a very agile way. And so I think part of that still continues, but the more interesting thing going forward is how public cloud is now being used in a lot of more enterprise, broader, deeper ways within organizations. So we think about the long-time impact of specific vendors like AWS and Salesforce that and Workday that are all of a sudden broadening their approach, looking at incorporating different services, new offerings in terms of business applications, really take a broader approach that is disruptive to more areas of the applications market, but also from a go-to-market perspective gives them more control over customer conversations and the ability to influence a lot of traditional markets and traditional players. The hybrid pull-through is another area where for those vendors that can control the hybridization, the management, the integration of different services, they're going to be able to influence the public cloud revenue. That's an increasingly important part of the hybridization of workloads going forward. And we're seeing a sizable portion of enterprise customers already adopting hybrid. We think that's a model that will continue to have an impact going forward. And then lastly, this area around the customization of services into different vertical industries. The industry cloud, if you will, in terms of both the applications that are being delivered, as well as in some cases the infrastructure as a service and platforms that are actually customized to verticals like financial services and healthcare. And so we see that as a big opportunity for these ecosystems, which all vendors are talking about striving to develop, real value there in terms of taking more horizontal platforms, customizing them but pulling through a lot of underlying platform and infrastructure in the process. So for the larger vendors, building those out is a huge part of the public cloud strategy going forward. And so I think when you roll up all of those things, what it really means is for public cloud, it's going to be less about the point competition around specific functions or the price of compute and storage resources, and have a much broader impact in terms of the value that they're able to deliver to customers with these services, but also the opportunity for vendors in terms of their participation and how public cloud can be much more than just a scale play where there's very low margins and very low value. We're looking at real sustainable business models that pull in public cloud as one element of something that actually delivers a lot more value to customers in the end. And so with that setup, I'll hand it over to Jillian Mirandi, Senior Analyst on the Cloud team, to go through the findings from the most recent public cloud benchmark. But also know that due to all this new development around public cloud, we're also launching research into the customer behavior for use cases to really get a customer perspective around how they're using public cloud, how it relates to industry customization, how it relates to hybrid. And so we'll have more research in June as the results of that come back for the next version of this webinar. Jill?
Great. Thank you, Allan. Thanks, everyone, for joining us. So we'll kick off the presentation by looking at the total market cloud. This slide and the next couple slides are from our new public cloud market forecast report, which is a companion document to the public cloud benchmark. And what I wanted to highlight here are that the cloud entry points, they really vary among customers. Three of the key areas where customers are adding public cloud to their environments are around CRM or HR. So very important functions, but they're more standalone or fringe applications. And you see Salesforce and Workday have done very well here. There's also file sharing and productivity. So companies like Box, Google, Office 365, these applications are very broad, and they touch everyone in the organization as well as all of the business segments. So from startup, SMB, even consumer and enterprise, everyone uses these types of file sharing and productivity apps. And they also come through shadow IT. And that brings us to infrastructure. So infrastructure and platforms are the last, or sometimes the first, it really depends on the customer, entry point for a cloud vendor to get into a customer. Now again, most of this is occurring through shadow IT. Customers, developers either want to build and run a new application, they want to test out cloud and bring it in that way. A lot of times it's for a marketing campaign or R&D, or if they need capacity. So they want to move an application or they're adding a whole new group and they don't want to invest in building out the data center. So they'll get someone like an Amazon. So again, three completely different use cases, a fringe app like CRM or HR, infrastructure, and file sharing. Those are just three examples of how cloud is getting into these environments. And then you look at the three leaders here. These are overall revenue leaders in the public cloud benchmark, Microsoft, Amazon, and Salesforce. So all of these leaders, they started out with a pretty specific strategy or area and got into the customers. So Microsoft started by converting Office customers to O365. Amazon started with infrastructure, Salesforce with CRM. But now they're all expanding pretty quickly horizontally and vertically. We'll get into this a little bit further, but Salesforce is the perfect example. Started with CRM, made the market there, have expanded into services, marketing, platform, as well as into, I believe it's 6 different specific industries. And that leads us to the last point. The broader the portfolio, the better. There's not really a clear path to getting public cloud in your environment. So the broader number of entry points will really give you the most opportunities. Microsoft, Google, IBM, SAP, Salesforce are all very good examples in the public cloud space. But at an even broader scale, companies who have public cloud, private cloud, professional services, hybrid capabilities, That gives them even more leverage and even more coverage. So companies like IBM, HP, some SIs like Accenture, they're doing extremely well in the hybrid cloud market and private cloud market, as well as to some extent the public cloud market, because they do have all those different entry points. So to wrap it up, all of these vendors, almost all the vendors that we cover in the cloud market today, they want to become the business platform on which to run a business. And they're coming at this from a number of different ways. So Salesforce comes from the apps point of view, Amazon from the complete opposite infrastructure point of view, someone like HP as the IT, overall IT point of view. So the competition really is heightening. This slide looks at software as a service. So this is the most mature segment, and the growth is slowing, but it will continue to be the largest segment in the market. Leading cloud pure play vendors, so Salesforce, Workday, ServiceNow, MuleSoft, they made cloud markets in their specific areas, so CRM, HR, ITSM, and now are expanding both into LOBs and industries. Now, traditional vendors who are leading, so SAP and Microsoft, they first converted their portfolios and then customer bases to the cloud. And now what they're doing is leveraging their more core strengths to expand their cloud businesses. So for Microsoft, they're looking to their partners. Microsoft traditionally has a very strong partner ecosystem. So this enables them to get cloud really to the whole spectrum of customers, from startups to the enterprises, as well as industries, geos. Partners can add managed services. So they started selling cloud directly a few years ago, and are now really investing in those partners to expand the business. That also helps them lower their sales and marketing costs, which is making a lot of the pure plays, it's giving them challenges because their spending is so high, they're not profitable. And Microsoft also is leveraging their strong developer base. So they've had an on-premise platform for quite a while, and now those .NET developers are moving to the Azure platform. With SAP, it's a little bit different. So they're leveraging their core strength around the industry channels. So instead of taking their cloud and slicing it into different industries like Salesforce is doing, building up industries, SAP has had industries established for quite some time. So now they're taking their cloud portfolio and adding it to their large portfolio of industry-specific solutions and going to market very quickly without having to change a whole lot. This slide highlights platform as a service. So this is the smallest bucket of revenue, and I think it will continue to be the smallest, but it's critical across both SaaS and infrastructure vendors for them to be successful. And the reason why it's so critical is because of the ecosystem that it helps drive. So you can have your micro-industry customization or really macro-industry customization here. It helps to fill gaps, so applications around security or mobile or analytics. There are also managed services vendors cropping up in the ecosystems. As I mentioned before, vendors are trying to be the business platform, but they can't be all things to all people. So what they're doing is investing in this ecosystem, leaving plenty of white spaces for partners to fill gaps, to build their own businesses, essentially expanding the revenue pie for everyone. But for these platform vendors themselves, it's allowing them to very, very quickly expand their offerings without building them themselves. Paas, it used to provide the stickiness layer, and to some extent with the APIs it still does, but this stickiness is decreasing. Vendors are adding language support. They're either supporting open source platforms such as Cloud Foundry or open sourcing their own technology, as well as investing in companies like Docker and container management. So in conclusion, the developer, or in this case, the customer is really king. All of the investments that these vendors are doing is to ease development, add functionality, and improve portability. We expect this to continue. I think that the leaders you see here will will maintain the leadership position over the next few years, but there will be a next generation of cloud platforms. I think Bluemix will be in there. I think Pivotal will be in there that are more open and portable that will that some enterprises will migrate towards. Lastly, we'll talk about the infrastructure as a service segment. So this segment will continue growing as a share of the market, but the high usage growth will be offset by decreasing more commodity pricing. Vendors will need to differentiate to beat the current leaders. I think leaders over the next few years will shake out to be Amazon, Google, and Microsoft. However, IBM, Fujitsu, and regional players like Alibaba will definitely be in there as well. Where it will be a challenge is for some of the multi-lines like HP, some of the telcos. They'll really have to talk. They'll have to talk about their use cases to differentiate. In doing the developer study, time and time again, developers were just unclear what types of workloads would do better on the different clouds, what use cases. So I think understanding that gap and really highlighting it, as well as working with Amazon, Google, Microsoft, making sure that the data can go pretty easily back and forth will be key for the larger players to stay in this market. Secondly, this market continues to consolidate. Some vendors are stepping back from the market. Dell has stepped back and is now more of a broker of public cloud services. Rackspace and Verizon, while they still offer public cloud, they won't offer vanilla public cloud compute and storage. They'll wrap the managed services around it, charge a little bit differently. They don't want to go head-to-head with the Amazons and Googles. They're differentiating through those managed services. There's also been quite a number of acquisitions, so Savvis, Tier 3, OpSource. I think Joint and Rackspace, although very large, I think they are ripe for acquisition over the next few years, maybe by a large multi-line or even an SI or a telco looking for a more scalable cloud. Lastly, regional players, I think, will have a spot within their given countries. So Alibaba is doing very well in China. They opened a data center in Hong Kong, and now they're in Silicon Valley as well. So they're basically the Amazon of China, very scalable, low cost. I think they'll be a huge player in APAC, maybe globally. And there's Orange, BT, Korea Telecom, quite a few of these regional players that I think will, they have the data center set up, they understand the data sovereignty laws, they're in a lot of the enterprises, and they have a big opportunity to offer cloud as well. So now we'll switch gears more towards the quarter. So this highlights the 4Q14 public cloud revenue. And what's a little bit different about this report is that we segmented the vendors by their backgrounds to show how their backgrounds have affected their success or lack thereof. And it also helps to visualize what we're talking about on the next couple slides. The x-axis is the corporate year-to-year growth. Y-axis is public cloud year-to-year growth. Size of the bubble is 4Q14 volume of public cloud revenue. And also to note, these are the top, I believe it's 19 vendors out of 50, so the top 35, 40% of the vendors we covered that have generated $400 million or more in the trailing 12 months. So the next few slides, this is another reason that we added this grouping. So it just highlights how different the backgrounds are of the leading vendors. This is, again, the top 25 vendors. You can see they come from multi-line, software, pure plays, telco, internet. I don't know if any SIs made it onto this graph, but in the private section, in the private cloud, they definitely will. So it just shows the diversity of these vendors. But then you hop into infrastructure as a service, and this is a little bit different because it has the leading vendors, so Amazon, Fujitsu, and IBM, and then a whole host of the telco background vendors that are pretty large but slow growing. And over time, I think that these you can see these vendors changing and the groupings kind of shifting out. Now we'll talk about each group of vendor and a little bit about their backgrounds. So this first group in orange is the multi-line vendors. Their public cloud businesses are growing, but the shrinking hardware sales is and will continue to negatively impact the top line. Infrastructure as a service is a natural first step for a lot of these guys. So IBM, Fujitsu, HP, they moved from selling just traditional infrastructure to cloud infrastructure as well. But transforming the overall business is quite challenging. While these vendors are doing well, of course, they're in the leaderboards. Selling as a service, pay-as-you-go is a lot different than selling huge deals every few years. So while the revenue and the customers continues to grow, the volume will continue to decrease. Now, Oracle's a bit different because they're more of an application vendor. They were slow to the cloud, but have invested quite heavily and are seeing corporate growth. So they kind of belong in both categories. This next group of vendors is the telco and hosting vendors. Again, they're pretty large, but they're very slow-moving. They have slow-moving cloud businesses. Some of the vendors are getting out of the vanilla public space and moving towards a more fully managed public cloud as part of a hybrid IT environment. Verizon is doing this, Rackspace is doing this, a few of the other telcos, and they are set up to offer a more hybrid environment. I think that they'll do well here, but I think growth will continue to be pretty slow. And similar to the multi-lines, these telcos really need to highlight and message their differentiation. I think the market doesn't quite understand the differences between the clouds, and they need to message what workload should go to a telco cloud and why should I choose them. So here are the applications or the software vendors in blue. Microsoft and SAP are really breakout vendors here. Microsoft is a market leader at this point mainly due to converting its Office customers, but Azure is also a very quickly growing business. It's a leader in the Paas and growing fast in infrastructure. I think it will be a leader among all categories. Now, SAP, they've acquired quite a few leading SaaS vendors over the years. They have those. They've converted customers to cloud versions of their own products, and they're doing quite a bit of expansion with HANA. Most recently, they launched SAP Business Suite for HANA, which is helping to move legacy ERP clients to the cloud. They also have added capabilities here through Concur and Ariba that will continue to grow that portfolio, and I think they're doing quite well. These lighter green companies are the internet companies, so Google and AWS. When I talk about these companies, it's really all about innovation, their developer ecosystems, very quick service launches and service updates, the ecosystem, and the community. Now, the background for these vendors is key because of their e-commerce and search backgrounds. They just required much better data centers than the rest, and so they took what they learned from developing their own data centers and quickly developing their own web services to build cloud businesses. And then they went a step further to open up those processes and some of the services they use to build their own applications. They're now offering those to customers. So customers can very easily or more easily develop their own applications. People are going to these vendors. They just continue to innovate, and I think they'll continue to do very well. The corporate growth for both of these vendors is slowing. Their cloud business affects them both a little bit differently. So with Amazon, they've traditionally looked to their cloud business as a profit center, and for a while that was working. They had about 14% operating margin. Since they've had to slash prices and improve all of the services, improve sales and marketing, we estimate that margin has gotten lower and lower. We see Amazon corporate kind of going back and forth or hovering right around that zero profit margin. So I think in the long run, that will negatively affect AWS because companies like Google and Microsoft and IBM, they have much larger and much more, not much larger, much more profitable businesses backing them up, whereas Amazon doesn't really have that. For Google, the ad revenue is slowing quite a bit as screen sizes get smaller. So Google, they were a little bit slow to cloud. They had it for a while, but it was more for consumers. They've since put a lot of time and energy into really making their cloud business a cohesive platform and are ready. And we think that's going to eventually drive their corporate growth. Right now, both businesses are less than 5% of total revenue. And lastly, we have the pure plays. So with these guys, corporate growth is equal to public cloud growth, except for some of their professional services. And what we're seeing here is expansion on all fronts. So portfolio expansion in terms of LOB expansion, platform investments, industry, geo, they are just running fast at everything, and really for a good reason. Now that cloud isn't a differentiator, it's harder for them to get into customers. They're also expanding their market segments. So in the quarter, Workday has begun leveraging CNSIs even more to get credibility and to have them pull them into the enterprise. Salesforce launched an enterprise version of Heroku, and Google has been adding security and control to Google for Work to make them more enterprise ready. Conversely, ServiceNow launched Express to get more into the SMB segment. So these vendors, they'll continue to see growth, but it really is a double-edged sword for them. They're growing at the cost of profitability, like I mentioned. So the rest of the vendors on this graph, they can't really get away with operating at a loss. These pure plays can, but I don't think it'll last forever. I believe that it's not really by accident that they're doing this, and if they slow the net new revenue growth by cutting S&M, they could change their profitabilities in a few quarters, but right now they just want to get into as many customers and get as entrenched as they can across these customers. Now I'll talk a little bit about how public cloud, global trends are on public cloud. In the Americas, the U.S. market is saturating. And this for two reasons that go hand in hand. The U.S. is usually early adopters of new technology, and most of the public cloud companies are based in the U.S. So now what companies are doing is they're investing in industry focus. For the U.S. right now, it's mostly around government, healthcare, financial services, so some of the more highly regulated industries. Brazil and Canada have seen a lot of data center investments. We think that these are two areas that are ripe for growth. Canada is pretty mature, but I think we'll be seeing regional teams and more companies out of here. In EMEA, UK, Germany, and France, usually in that order, are the key areas of investment. There's been a data center build out recently in Germany to comply with regulations. And over the last few years, Ireland has also been a hot spot for R&D and data center development. We're seeing a lot of local teams crop up. London is serving as the European hub for companies like Box, Google, Amazon, a number of others. And service providers too. There's a lot of local service providers that cloud vendors are partnering with. The service provider will speak the language, will understand the customer, and will really help them get into these new markets. For the APAC region, Japan, Australia, and China are the key areas of investment. Slowing growth in Japan and China will negatively affect growth, but it still is a quickly growing region in comparison with the others. And China, there was a lot of investment in China in late 2013 by companies like AWS, Microsoft, IBM. We haven't seen a lot of this investment paying off yet, but the process is just very slow with the regulations and partnering, as well as with the very successful local vendors. So China will continue to be an area of investment, but also a challenging country to expand in. Lastly, I'll highlight some of the growth markets. So in the Americas, Brazil does have a plethora of its own IT company, like Ramco is very popular in the cloud ERP. Mexico is also an area of data center investment, so we expect more cloud growth there. In APAC, India and Malaysia are the next areas of investment. Microsoft has invested quite a bit in India, and we expect others to follow. And lastly, EMEA. So after a presence in the UK, Germany, and France is established, the Nordics and the Netherlands will be the next regions of investment. And lastly, South Africa and Israel have proven to be tech hubs. And whereas regional, I don't see a lot of regional expansion there yet. I think there'll be two areas where we'll see a lot of acquisitions taking place out of. This slide highlights the acquisitions in the quarter. So over the past year, or I would say 2 years at this point, we've seen a lot more smaller acquisitions that help to fill gaps and add capabilities and add industry-specific solutions as opposed to these big splashy acquisitions we had a few years ago. For vertical expansion, CSC and ServiceNow both acquired companies that had public sector compliance to help move into that sector. To deepen core capabilities, we saw SAP invest in Concur. That was probably the biggest acquisition in this segment. Intuit invested in Zero Paper, so a cloud accounting service. We see a lot of investment in big data and analytics. DataPipe invested in GoGrid, which GoGrid was initially an infrastructure as a service company, but over the last year has really gone into big data, and DataPipe's actually shutting down their more vanilla infrastructure and really leveraging that big data capability. Microsoft invested in Revolution Analytics and Querio, and then security. So Box invested in AirPost, HP and Voltage Security, and I think we're going to continue to see these kind of tuck-in acquisitions around analytics, security. I think we'll see more probably tiny acquisitions around mobile backend as a service, API management, container management, as well as I've been saying this for probably a year, and it hasn't happened yet, but I do think we'll see another round of roll-ups around the infrastructure as a service. So Joint, Rackspace, there's a few other players there, Blue Lock, that are good targets for a company that wants that scalable cloud. So we'll have to wait and see, I guess, over the next couple quarters. So that goes over the broader market and the trends there. And now we'll talk about the more forward-looking trends.
Thanks, Jill. So this is Kelsey. I'm going to start off a little bit with the SaaS market. So if you look at the bubble graph on the left here, you can see some clear leaders, those being Salesforce and Microsoft in terms of volume. Salesforce was really early to market, and as Jill mentioned earlier, they've been able to maintain this leadership by really expanding beyond CRM and those horizontal business applications into more of like an industry play and adding analytics. But now we're seeing traditional vendors really investing to catch up. Microsoft, as we talked about earlier, has done a really good job thus far in transitioning those core Office customers to Office 365. They're using that traditional ecosystem of partners that they've had and kind of making it easier for them to sell cloud. And now they're adding the cross-platform enablement piece, so expanding Office 365 onto new platforms such as iOS and Android, really a far cry from the old Microsoft, and just creating new revenue streams for those core products. For SAP, another traditional vendor that is now expanding into cloud, but has done this largely through acquisitions such as SuccessFactors, Ariba, Hybris. Concur will start contributing significantly to their SaaS revenue in 2015. But I think aside from the leaders, one of the more interesting parts on this graph is the pure play vendors, which are the pink bubbles on here, and how they're kind of tightly hugging the axis. And these vendors are small, but they want to be able to scale to the size of a Salesforce, who is another pure play that has been early to market but shown you can grow to the size to larger than the traditional vendors. And to do this, these smaller pure plays are trying to move into the enterprise to move that volume needle. The challenge there, though, for them is that they don't have the distribution or the credibility or that brand awareness that the larger vendors do have within the enterprise segment. So to address that, we're seeing these vendors partner with the CNSI firms who really act as the strategic advisors to large enterprises. This is especially important as hybrid IT really becomes the end goal for many enterprises. As you can see in the pie chart on the right, enterprises are really looking to CNSI firms to provide them with those outcome-driven roadmaps to hybrid environments. 40% is a pretty significant chunk of enterprises leveraging those firms. So for the smaller pure plays, having a presence, a practice within those global services firms will be huge in capturing that opportunity. Some examples we've seen are like Box, who partnered with Accenture around industries, and this really ties back to customers wanting outcomes and solutions that are tailored to their business out of the box. And then Workday has seen pretty significant traction, I'd say, over the last year with CNSI vendors either expanding practices, such as Accenture and CSC, they both invested in their existing practices, or acquiring Workday-focused services firms. Aon Hewitt acquired one in the UK, I believe, and PwC acquired one in Canada. So getting Workday's name into the conversations in new regions, and in those conversations with SAP and Oracle, who Workday is most likely going to have to replace in enterprises, because at this point, within a large enterprise segment, growth is going to come at someone else's expense, and for these smaller players to break into that segment, they're going to have to displace a larger vendor that has the enterprise credibility that they may not to date. So just to sum up this slide, small SaaS vendors are looking to move the needle on revenue, and to do so, they need to expand into a large enterprise segment. But with the growth coming at someone else's expense, using the CNSI firms like Accenture, Deloitte, PwC, who act as strategic advisors to these large enterprises, they're going to need those firms to increase distribution, prove their enterprise viability, and get engaged in those hybrid conversations.
Thanks, Kelsey. This is the Paas leaders, and I really just wanted to show you just the diverseness, again, of the backgrounds here. They started out from very different places, but now they're looking quite similar from the platform point of view. They're all investing in easing development, building an ecosystem, getting into both the startups and the enterprises, mobile, analytics, APIs, and open source or open sourcing their own code. So this slide comes from our inaugural Cloud Developer and Platform Report. And it shows where the market is today and where these two groups are starting to go. The x-axis is the level of adoption or popularity. The y-axis is the level of portability. So when we mapped the vendors on these two axes, these two groups really stood out. So in the first group, Amazon, Microsoft Azure, Google Cloud Platform, the first wave of public cloud adopters, this is where they went. One of the biggest reasons is because these are the only vendors available, but they were also looking for different things. They were more of the bleeding edge adopters. These vendors had broad tool sets, they have communities, they have automation, they're cost effective, but the portability is rather limited in comparison with the open source group, because the code is mainly proprietary. They are becoming more open to expand. They're mostly opening up their own code and exposing APIs, which these vendors are so huge that it's almost like an open source community in themselves. And they're also adding enterprise features, so security, management, monitoring, the ability to easily connect with other enterprise tools, as well as managed service partners. Now the second group, so IBM, Bluemix, Outlaw, Canopy, Pivotal, this is where we're seeing the second wave or a more enterprise adopter is heading. The customers are looking for a more, it doesn't necessarily have to be open source, but a more portable platform so they don't get locked in. It's much more important for the enterprise and this group to diversify their risks. So they're actually not really testing, but actually implementing a few different platforms for different purposes. These vendors to date have lower adoption, but they're all investing to drive adoption by offering free tiers, startup programs. They're doing a lot of marketing, and they're trying to get high adoption, but they're already open, whereas the other group has high adoption and needs to improve portability. So we think over the next, 2015 will be a big year for the platform space. Right now there's a lot of platforms out there, and there's not enough developers to really provide the ecosystems and level of expertise that the market needs. So we expect quite a shakeout. But we also expect that most vendors, even startups at this point, are coding to multiple platforms and giving customers the choice. So whereas there will be a roll-up, I think getting that portability will be huge, that people like SAP HANA, Salesforce, Salesforce has high adoption, but the Salesforce and SAP developers, they're really bought into that application layer. So you're not going to go start a net new business that doesn't connect to their applications on those platforms. They're investing to try to go in that direction, but right now it is an even third kind of wave of developers that will migrate to them. And with that, the floor is open for questions.
So, if anybody has any questions, please send them through the Q&A function. All right, and our first question, can you please comment on where, if you see BMW vCloud Air making progress? Sure. So in terms of the vCloud Air offering, where we see it fitting into this landscape and the overall cloud landscape, is that it's obviously a little bit later in the market than even some of their larger peers like Microsoft and IBM in terms of being a provider of cloud services, but that a lot of activity going on with that offering and with VMware in general in terms of being a cloud provider. Although they're taking a very targeted approach, primarily looking at their own traditional customer base in terms of providing cloud resources into that environment and connecting what's on-prem with the cloud-delivered services. They're really capitalizing on a lot of the themes that we're looking at with today's webinar in terms of geographic expansion, getting outside the U.S. very quickly early on in terms of the life cycle of the vCloud Air offerings, as well as looking at partnerships with providers such as Google in terms of the go-to-market and the offerings, targeting specific verticals around, specifically we've noticed around healthcare. And so all of those things are, we think, positive, will have long-term benefits in terms of, yes, being a little bit later than some of the players, but catching up very quickly in terms of what's driving the public cloud adoption going forward, not focusing as much on just the speeds and feeds of the technology and the price points that can be delivered. And so I think all of those things are positives. They're still growing off a small base, so you won't see them. I don't believe that they were included in the graphs for today's presentation because they're not in the top 25 yet. But I think all of those things kind of point to a strategy that we think aligns with where the market is going. All right. Next question. What is the tipping point in organization size, server PC count, where you see companies moving from on-prem to cloud? And is there any way to identify organizations who may move to cloud? I
wouldn't say there's necessarily a tipping point. I think one of the biggest ways that infrastructure as a service is implemented is when a company has the need for more capacity and they're faced with either investing in a data center or virtualization or cloud. I think in that case, a lot of times they'll at least test out cloud. But I think it's really when, on the software side, it's when something is up for renewal. Maybe a big applications license is up for renewal, they want to test something out. But what we are seeing is more and more companies using cloud as part of their overall transformational strategy. A lot of that's led by the SIs. Salesforce has taken steps to lead their own. And even with AWS's consulting arm, I think they're trying to move to that as well. There's been a number of ISVs going all in on AWS, but I don't think we can really quantify a tipping point.
I mean, I think regardless of size, one of the indicators that we've seen is that you get this pressure in terms of either externally catering to customer needs, and there's pain points within the organization to do that, or internally between line of business looking for services, IT having more and more requirements with tight budgets. We don't see a lot of overall broad increases in terms of IT spend, and so we see a progression a lot of times for a culmination of how cloud can, rather than be used disparately within an organization or outside of the approved / monitored IT procurement process, that we're seeing more and more customers standardize in terms of how cloud can be used. IT plays a strong role in that, and that it becomes those are the accounts where the opportunity for the providers really increases because you're looking at more strategic use, broader adoption across the organization, and that's the tipping point that I think has the most impact for vendors in this space is how do you prompt those conversations so that you really get to a place of strategic importance rather than tactical selling in with different solutions, and that's, for the vendors that can solve that and push more customers to that tipping point for how cloud is being used, that's where the larger opportunity and benefits lie.
All right, next question. Many legacy vendors promote private cloud as an alternative to public cloud. What's TBR's point of view on this?
I think that a lot of the legacy vendors were quite taken aback at the success of the early public clouds, like Amazon, Salesforce. I think their first reaction was to discredit public cloud a bit, and I think that's why they had a focus on private. They could also, the business model around private cloud is more similar to traditional business models, so I think it was more in their comfort zone. But I do think it is a bit of a marketing ploy. I think that they'll need to start promoting the use cases for hybrid. So, of course, some applications will need to run in a private cloud, but the overall IT environment will be more of a hybrid IT environment. So I think rather than, and we've seen them also now talk about public cloud. IBM, HP, they have public clouds that they're promoting as part of the whole. So initially, I think the larger vendors were a bit scared of public cloud, wanted to discredit it. They thought private was a differentiator, but I think their real differentiator will be more in that hybrid IT environment and overall management.
And I think for a lot of customers, it's the offerings in private cloud are more abundant and achievable than they have been in the past. And so for certain workloads and use cases and even overall customer culture, that private cloud is a better fit for their services. With a hosted option, you can still get the OpEx benefits of not having to build and maintain and own it themselves in terms of the services that are being delivered from that private environment. And so I think going forward you're going to see, a fit for both. So I don't think that it's necessarily erosion. I think it opens up more opportunity for where cloud can be used within most of the organizations that we're interacting with.
All right. Do you see the public PaaS players having a vision around enterprise PaaS in the future with a hybrid PaaS approach? If they do make a move, how do you think it will impact on existing dominant enterprise PaaS players?
So I think for this whole concept of hybrid PaaS, we are tracking PaaS both in a private and a public sense in terms of the multi-tenant or single-tenant delivery method for those platforms and services. And so I think that hybrid model, it plays into a lot of different things in terms of the availability of containers, the standards in terms of the development environment and the production environment that erodes some of the, as Jill said, some of the stickiness that early PaaS environments have. So I think you are seeing, the environment many times is going to be very similar or the same. It's really about whether it's deployed on-prem or in a private environment or in a public environment. And so I think you're going to see the differences between those types of markets erode, perhaps more rapidly than even some of the infrastructure or the software offerings, because I think that the flexibility for enterprises to be able to develop privately, deploy publicly, or the inverse are, such that we're seeing a lot of interest there. And so I think you're going to see vendors really step up to the plate. IBM, for instance, is already, with Bluemix, providing either a private or a public option for how that's delivered. And so I think you're going to see more blended models going forward in terms of the public-private and then where the solution is actually deployed once it's been tested and ready for production.
All right. Next question. What workloads are the first to move to cloud?
So for public cloud, we think sort of the fringe applications like a CRM or HR, infrastructure, so either to move a current application onto a cloud, but more likely to do test and dev, and then some productivity and file sharing. So things like a Box or Dropbox is pretty easy to bring in-house, or Google Apps. Microsoft does great success with O365. So I think those are three popular entry points for vendors. But with our public cloud research publishing in a couple months, we'll know a more detailed list of how vendors are adopting public cloud.
All right. We have time for one or two more questions here. Is security a risk and regulatory policies pressure as much deterrent as advertised, or do you see growth of off-prem pushing through that issue?
I think the regulatory pressure is very real. I see that with data sovereignty in different countries, and vendors are reacting, especially Germany and China come to mind there. The security and risk, I think, is a pain point that I think it is very real, but I think that cloud vendors are doing so much investment in those areas, it's less and less of a deterrent. If you think about current data centers and how many times your on-premise email crashes, those I think don't get highlighted as much, and people again are a bit scared of public cloud. And yeah, data centers go down and things will happen, but I think the security is more of a fear than a real problem.
All right, and maybe we have time for one last question. Any data points around cloud service brokers like Equinix enabling a wider adoption of public and hybrid clouds? What are your thoughts around the connectivity portion that typically a CSP can provide with SLA, QoS, and differentiation that they provide?
So Equinix has a pretty cool model. Their cloud service or the cloud service brokers in general, I think will do really well. And Allan can talk a little bit to that. But Equinix in general, they have a bunch of data centers, and a lot of the cloud vendors and traditional vendors have racks in those data centers, and they have physical dedicated connections to and from each other. So that means that your data can get shared without ever going over the internet, and it's a lot faster. So I think Equinix, they just announced their new program, I think within the last 6 months. They have a lot of people in it. I think we'll see more and more of that. And I think the whole brokerage model in general will do very well. But I think people like Equinix and even Verizon data centers and other data centers that are physically connecting clouds will help with security and with speed and SLAs of getting data from one cloud to another.
Yeah, and I think the whole shift around hybrid is really, as well as growth in private off-prem, really highlighted the need for the network and the focus on SLAs and quality of service. As you look at bringing in not only your own data centers, but public cloud services from a third party, the connection and the interdependency in terms of the performance of the network all of a sudden becomes a more critical part as you're tying multiple different delivery methods together in these hybrid type environments. And so we've already heard from customers that have used third parties for their own private data centers that the move to hybrid, this is something that they need to address for the third-party data centers as well. And we've already seen a number of partnerships between some of the larger cloud providers and the network players in terms of being able to provide and highlight the connectivity in the network between data centers as part of the value proposition for the private and hybrid offerings. So I think there's a lot more growth and opportunity in that space going forward, driven by the ways that enterprises are going to be using multi-cloud environments in the future.
All right, I think that's all we have time for today. So thank you, Allan, Jill, and Kelsey, and thank you everyone for your questions. You can follow the Analyst as well as TVR on the Twitter handles listed on the next slide here, and please check out our pages on SlideShare and YouTube as well. Additionally, before you sign off, we'd like to ask you to take a brief survey about today's webinar. Your feedback on today's presentation would be greatly appreciated. Otherwise, thank you for joining and have a good afternoon.